Good morning, everybody. I'm Anushka Makbul, the Programs Associate at Urban Green Council. Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. And we invite you to be mindful of these during the program, both when you're listening in and when you're asking questions. Welcome to today's event, Local Law 97, Unpacking the Proposed Rules 2023. I'd now like to turn it over to our CEO, John Mandyke.
Anushka, thank you. Good morning to everybody. Happy Climate Week. We have more than 1,000 people registered for this briefing today, and we're thrilled to welcome you all to the latest information on Local Law 97. For those of you that don't know us, we're Urban Green Council. We're an environmental nonprofit dedicated to decarbonizing buildings for healthy and resilient communities. We want to be your go-to resource on all issues related to building decarbonization, and regulations are a big piece of that. So please check us out and see the work that we do, and today is a good example of that. We've got a full agenda today. I want to thank the Department of Buildings and Deputy Commissioner Laura Popa, who will be on shortly, and her team for joining us for today's event. And we look forward to unpacking the proposed rules for Local Law 97. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator now, Danielle Manley, on Urban Green's policy team. Danielle, take it from here.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I am Danielle. I'm the manager of policy here at Urban Green. I'm really excited to introduce today's panel to you. We have a team of 4 very excellent people who are from the city's Department of Buildings who are helping to lead the way in implementing the law. And they are here this morning to help us unpack what's in the latest proposed rules. We have Laura Popa, who is Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability at DOB, Gina Bocra, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer, Beth Golub, who is Director of Sustainability Policy and Legal Matters, and Emily Hoffman, who is Director of Building Energy and Emissions Performance. So Laura, Beth, Gina, and Emily, we thank you in advance for your time today and for answering people's questions. We are going to get started in just a moment with the presentation from DOB. That's going to last for about the first half of this webinar. And then we will move to a question and answer session to follow for the second half. So during the presentation, you'll be able to type your questions through the Zoom Q&A box that's linked on your screen, and we'll cover as many as we can during that period. We also know that a number of you have submitted questions ahead of time, and so we thank you for that. And we also hope that the slides themselves help to answer some of those early questions that we got. You can upvote questions from other attendees that you want to see answered. That'll help us prioritize them. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura Popa from DOB to get us started.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, John and Anushka, and to the whole team at Urban Green for our partnership, for allowing us this platform to talk about the rules. And thank you for the attendees for your interest. So we are going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the rules. I know that's what everyone wants. But first, if we can go to the next slide, I just want to talk about our broader mobilization efforts. So last week when we released the rule, it wasn't just about the rule, it was a mobilization plan for 97 compliance. And so the key points of this mobilization plan relate to enhanced funding and financing. So the city is working with the PSC to ensure we get our fair share of the $5 billion they have that's going to be invested in statewide energy efficiency to support Local Law 97 compliance. We noted focus on tax programs at the city level, J51, making sure that the IRA funding can be drawn down by building owners. That's $625 million nationwide. Greenhouse gas reduction funding, loans from the U.S. Department of Energy. And so our first goal is to help building owners fund and finance these retrofits. The second part of our mobilization plan is even more comprehensive outreach with New York City Accelerator. We'll be putting up a slide at the end with the contact information for Accelerator. About 75% of the people who have moved into compliance in the first compliance period have worked with Accelerator We're very proud of that program. DOB has been doing information sessions with them in council member and elected districts. We had a DOB Accelerator Day yesterday. So this program is really important to help building owners comply. It's a free resource, and they'll provide people with technical assistance and hook them up with financing and let them know about incentives. There's now a document listing all incentives on the Accelerator's website for Local Law 97 compliance. We have implementation task forces. So we are, of course, interested and need to know what's happening on the ground. What are building owners and managers seeing that's working and what's not working? How is our workforce doing? What kind of retrofit companies are in the mix, and what technologies are being used, and what kind of financing everyone is receiving, and what financing is difficult to get. And so we are going to have these implementation task forces over the long term. And then, of course, finally, there is enforcement, and we have these rules. We'll be doing further rulemaking, which we'll also talk about at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Just to remind people about the Local Law 97 context, obviously everybody knows who this applies to and that it accounts for different buildings and building types. But I wanted to make sure everyone remembered that Local Law 97 provides for a lot of the things, for all of the things we'll be talking with you about today. So there are special rules for affordable housing, which is basically rent regulated units of 35% or more, and houses of worship. And we'll be talking about, we call those 321 buildings, Article 321 buildings. We'll be talking about that today. The law requires us to provide relief in the cases of financial hardship. We'll be doing a rule on that in the future. The law requires us to provide relief from unavoidable implementation hurdles. We will be talking about that today. And the law requires us to consider good faith efforts and penalty mitigation, which is a big part of the rule today. And so, next slide. So we have 3 rules that were released in the package. The first one is the 320 penalty framework. We have beneficial electrification credit in that rule, and we have various technical amendments. Our second rule is about the 321 buildings, right? The affordable housing / houses of worship. And we'll be covering requirements for compliance and penalties for non-compliance in that rule. And then we have a smaller rule related to Local Law 88, which was passed in 2009, which has come due January 1st, 2025. And that law requires buildings to upgrade their lighting and to do sub-metering. And now I'm going to turn it over to Beth Golub to talk about the 320 penalty framework. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Laura. So, as Laura said, Article 320 covers most of the market rate buildings that are subject to Local Law 97. And these buildings have 2 main compliance responsibilities that may result in penalties. So the first is that the building needs to submit its annual emissions report. That report is due by May 1st each year, beginning May 1st, 2025. And there is a monthly penalty. The rule confirms that the penalty is the highest penalty allowed by the law, which is the building's floor area times 50 cents, and that a number per month until the report is submitted. The second compliance requirement is to demonstrate that the emissions from the building are within the limit that's established by the law. So the rule also confirms that the penalty for being above the emissions limit is the highest allowed by the law, which is the overage, the emissions that are over the limit, times $268. And that's an annual penalty. So this rule also provides the penalty mitigation opportunities for this first compliance period, which is between 2024 and 2029. And the first penalty mitigation opportunity is a building owner can demonstrate that there's been an unexpected or unforeseeable event that has prohibited compliance for the building. And that would be a hurricane, a flood, a fire, an event of that nature. And then all of the other penalty mitigation opportunities are within the bucket of good faith efforts. So in order for a building owner to claim that there has been a good faith effort demonstrated such that the building should receive penalty mitigation, the building owner will need to have submitted the annual emissions report as required by Local Law 97. And if the building owner has been granted an adjustment under Local Law 97, that the building is in compliance with any terms from that adjustment. The building will need to have submitted its benchmarking for the prior calendar year and will have to demonstrate compliance with Local Law 88, the lighting upgrades and submeting installation, which we'll talk about a bit more later in this presentation. So if all of those things have been demonstrated, then a building owner will also need to demonstrate one of these categories here on the right side, which include a decarbonization plan pathway, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. A building owner can demonstrate that a complete application, meaning all of the work that's necessary to achieve the needed emissions reductions to reach the emissions limit for this compliance period, was submitted and approved by the department. And that would be demonstrated by providing the job numbers for all of the approved work, the estimated emissions reductions that will be achieved, and the timeline for completion with that work. A building owner can also demonstrate that they are working to achieve electrification readiness, meaning the owner is working with a utility to grow the building's electric service to increase capacity. So this would mean the owner has an approved electrical application for service upgrades to the building. And we would also need a copy of the work request to Con Ed or NYPA, as well as a copy of the utility's response. And finally, we'd need a timeline for the completion of that work. A building owner can demonstrate that the building was under the emissions limit at some point during the compliance period and now needs to adapt to a change in circumstance to get back under the limit. And of course, this would not be applicable to 2024. Compliance would already need to have been demonstrated at some point in the compliance period. If the building is a critical facility, that building can provide evidence to demonstrate that the payment of a penalty would impact that facility's ability to provide services that are critical to human life or safety. And if the building is in a state of financial hardship that prohibits compliance, that building can demonstrate that by applying for and receiving an adjustment to the building's emissions limit pursuant to Administrative Code Section 28320.7, which is provided in the law. And as Laura said, will be part of our next rule package. Okay, next slide. So the decarbonization plan pathway includes the building owner submitting by May 1st, 2025, the first report date under the law, a plan to reach net zero carbon emissions from the building by 2050. So this plan must include an energy audit. If the building is 50,000 square feet or greater, that would be a level 2 ASHRAE audit. And if it's below 50,000 square feet, that would be a level 1 ASHRAE audit. The plan also needs to include an inventory of the major equipment in the building. That would include the date of installation of that equipment, and that would include HVAC equipment, domestic hot water, electrical equipment, lighting and conveyance equipment. And the plan also needs to show the list of alterations that will be needed to get the building to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So that's a timeline for the alterations, the financing plan for the work, and the estimated emissions reductions that will be achieved along the way. So if a building owner provides an appropriate decarbonization plan by May 1st, 2025, then that building has to comply with this compliance period's emissions limit by 2026, as demonstrated in the report that's submitted May 1st, 2027. And this building owner cannot use RECs to meet the emissions limit in this compliance period. And then the building would need to further demonstrate by May 1st, 2028, that a complete application for the work to achieve compliance with the 2030 emissions limit has been approved by the department. Okay, next slide. So the rule also provides the enforcement framework in the event that a building is out of compliance with the emissions limit. So DOB can issue penalties. DOB will calculate the full penalty amount and issue the NOV to the building owner. And the building owner will have two options. They can pay the penalty, or they can pursue an adjudication by trial at oath. Where a building owner qualifies by demonstrating appropriate evidence of good faith efforts, DOB can offer that building a mediated resolution. So this is a legally binding agreement where DOB agrees not to pursue enforcement, and the building owner agrees to terms DOB has proposed to facilitate that building coming into compliance. So as long as the building owner demonstrates compliance with the mediated resolution, they can continue to submit their annual emissions report, and DOB will monitor the progress of the building. But if at any point the building demonstrates non-compliance with the terms of the mediated resolution, DOB will go back and can enforce the full penalties that have not yet been enforced for any demonstration of non-compliance that has passed. Okay, next slide, and I think I'm turning this over to Gina.
Thank you, Beth. Good morning. We've just had a discussion about penalty mitigation, and we're going to shift and talk about another opportunity for owners to reduce penalties, but through doing very targeted work. So beneficial electrification will reward owners with a credit for replacing fossil fuel equipment and installing high efficiency electric equipment, either for space conditioning or for water heating. And they can apply that emissions credit in either the first or the second compliance period. And it's important to recognize that this is a credit that was referenced and called out in the law in a couple of places. And this was a recommendation that came from the advisory board. So the way that Department of Buildings is implementing this beneficial electrification credit is that we have assigned a negative coefficient to the electricity that is consumed by this equipment. So if you install this equipment in your building and you do it very early, so between 2021 and 2026, we allow you to take double the credit for the emissions of that equipment. And that's a negative coefficient, so it results in a deduction. And you don't double that amount, it will be programmed into the system, but it's already taken into account in the coefficient that we've set. If you install the equipment between 27 and 29, then you get 1 times the credit for the emissions that are generated by that equipment. So if we can go to the next slide. So just a really quick summary of how that credit works. Your total electric emissions for the year for the building would be a result of taking your electricity emissions into account and subtracting those emissions that come from beneficial electrification. And then you multiply that amount of emissions times the coefficient that is in the law, the standard coefficient for electricity from the utility grid. And then you would add the electric consumption of the beneficial electric equipment times that negative coefficient. So the earlier, the better. And you add those two together, you get a reduced amount of electricity emissions for the building. We'll provide some calculation examples in the DOB Local Law 97 filing guide that will be coming out hopefully very soon. It also explains that there are 2 ways to approach this credit. If you have a smaller, simpler installation of electrical equipment, you can use a deemed approach, which basically allows you to take into account the capacity of the equipment times a couple other factors, and then that's the amount that you submit. For larger installations, they must be sub-metered, and the savings will be based on actual consumption. And in order for this to really motivate and boost the electrification market in New York City, we need to allow owners to bank this savings. So this doesn't just benefit owners who don't comply in 2024. We want them to also consider doing this work now, even if they have compliance in 2024 and are facing non-compliance issues only in 2030. So you would be able to bank a year's worth of this savings, and you would be able to apply that to a future year, all the way up until 2034. The credit cannot be combined, so you have to apply only a single year's worth of credit to a single year of emissions later in your reporting. And for every year of operation of the equipment, you get a year of credit. So if you have electrical equipment that's installed for the period of 5 years, then you would have 5 years worth of savings to apply in future reporting. Next slide.
Right, so I'm going to cover some of the additional technical changes that are in the rules. So the first one clarifies that properties must be calculated using either the building code occupancy groups or the ESPM property types that were introduced in Rule 103-14, but a single property cannot use a combination of both. Basically, you have to choose either the building code occupancy pathway or the ESPM property type pathway, but not both in the same building. And then the rule adds a marginal emissions coefficient for natural gas fuel cells for equipment that was installed prior to the passage of or the effective date of Rule 103-14. That's January 19th, 2023. And then it also requires that any distributed energy resources must be sub-metered for reporting purposes. And then the last thing is that there are a number of equation edits, and this just corrects the numbering that was in the equation.
So let's now move on to Article 321. So we have a new rule to cover the details and add clarity to reporting for rent-regulated buildings and houses of worship, which are not subject to 320. There are two different pathways within Article 321 that an owner may opt to use for reporting. And we just want to highlight that one of those pathways is for buildings that actually meet the 2030 limits of 320 for their building type. In those cases, which is about 20% of the buildings that are subject to 321, somewhere around there, they could simplify their reporting, submit an emissions report for 2025, submitted by a registered design professional, and they do not have to do the prescriptive energy conservation measures. So we want to just highlight that option for building owners and encourage all owners of buildings that fall into 321 to take a careful look at their benchmarking from 2022. In addition, there are the prescriptive energy conservation measures, and I just want to highlight, we've gotten a lot of questions. That is indeed a one-time report. So that report is due May 1st, 2025. And when an owner of a 321 building that is subject to 321 submits that report, or they submit the report showing that they've met the 2030 emissions limits, they are only submitting that report to the Department of Buildings one time, and they have completed their obligations under Article 321. And so I think everybody's familiar that there are 13 prescriptive energy conservation measures. It's important to recognize that the law calls out that you have to do these only when they're applicable to your building. So that's important for owners who don't have a steam heating system. Many of these are focused only on steam heating, and those would not be applicable to your building. So about 20% of owners will not be required to do those particular PECMs. And most of these are really good operations and maintenance practices, but we do want to talk a little bit more about the very detailed requirements. So if we can go to the next slide. The rule does clarify that the reporting has to be submitted by a qualified retro commissioning agent. Now, retro commissioning agent is defined under another law and rule for Local Law 87 as a registered design professional, a certified refrigerating system operating engineer, or a licensed high pressure boiler operating engineer. It can be one of those three, but they do have to be qualified, which means they also have to have a commissioning credential that is listed in this rule. Out of the 13 prescriptive energy conservation measures, 9 of them are very straightforward, and we require only an attestation from your commissioning agent that these inspections and checks have been done in your building and that everything is found to be in compliance. However, there are 4 of the 13 that require detailed inspection reports. So we're really focusing on those 4 PECMs that have a lot of energy impact in a building, and we want to make sure that that's where owners are investing their time and energy to make sure that those components of systems are operating as best they can. And so we will be issuing very soon a guide just for Article 321 that will contain the sampling requirements, and also will provide some more additional clarification in addition to the rule. And we welcome anyone's questions once that guide is out to let us know if you need more information. Next slide.
Okay, the Article 321 rule also includes details for the enforcement of penalties. So Article 321 does not include unique penalty provisions. So it does not have any of the good faith effort requirements that we detailed for Article 320. In this article, DOB's enforcement authority comes from our existing Article 2 powers, and violations will be treated as Class 2 violations under DOB's standard penalty framework. So the maximum penalty for the requirements of Article 321, the Article 321 similarly requires two demonstrations from a building. First, the building must submit the report, and there's a penalty for failing to submit that report, which is $10,000. And then the report must demonstrate that the building is in compliance with one of the energy conservation requirement pathways. And if a building is not in compliance with either pathway, that penalty would be an additional $10,000. So in addition to all of the enforcement framework and penalty resolution opportunities that exist in DOB's existing penalty framework, which is established in RCNY 102-01, this rule also creates penalty mitigation opportunities, which include a building demonstrating that there has been an unexpected or unforeseeable event, and that's the same standard as the Article 320 buildings: a flood, a hurricane, a fire, some circumstance that has kept the building from achieving compliance. A building can demonstrate that it is participating in an eligible energy conservation project. So this is a project that will be verified by the participating agency, which would be HPD, HDC, NYCHA, or HCR. And these are projects where the agency verifies that this project is going to bring the building into compliance. And there is also a mediated resolution tool for these buildings. So if a building demonstrates that it is working towards compliance, but it does need more time to finish the work to achieve compliance, DOB can offer a mediated resolution. Once again, it's a legally binding contract with terms that support the building achieving compliance. And if at any point the building demonstrates non-compliance with that agreement, DOB can then pursue full enforcement. Okay, next slide.
All right, thanks, Beth. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about Local Law 88. Local Law, just a reminder, I'm going to cover what was passed in Local Law 88, what's in the law. It was passed in 2009, as Laura said, and the requirements of Local Law 88 can be found in the Administrative Code in Article 310 for the upgrade of lighting systems and Article 311 for the electrical and submetering and tenant spaces requirements. So just high level, what's in Article 310 and 311. So for upgrade of lighting systems, it requires that the lighting, power, and controls comply with the New York City Energy Conservation Code that was in effect at the time that the project was, underway. So the work must have been done anytime between July 1st, 2010 up to December 31st, 2024. So we have a little bit more than a year left in that range. So if lighting was installed in 2010, you would go back to the energy code that was in effect at that time. If the lighting complied with the 2009 energy code, then you would be in compliance. It applies to residential and commercial buildings. However, dwelling units are excluded. So all the lighting in the residential and commercial buildings must be upgraded to the latest energy code at the time that it was installed. And then electrical submetering in tenant spaces in Article 311. This requires that any floor or tenant space that's over 5,000 square feet is separately submetered. Or if a tenant space spans multiple floors and it's over 5,000 square feet, it must be separately submetered. So this applies to commercial tenant spaces only, not dwelling units. But if you have a residential building with commercial tenants in it, or amenity spaces, those must be separately submetered as well. That would be required under Local Law 88. Next slide. So the rule that we just put out is how to report and who can report on Local Law 88. So you must meet the requirements that I stated earlier, and an attestation is due to DOB by May 1st, 2025, and this will be along with the 97 reporting. So this will be all built into DOB now, and an attestation would have to be sent to us, and it would have to be either by a registered design professional licensed in New York, or a licensed master electrician, or a licensed special electrician. So that's who has to sign off on the report. And then any building that fails to file with us will receive a $1,500 penalty for failing to file the lighting report, and another $1,500 penalty for failure to file the submetering report, and an additional $500 under the submeeting if for every covered tenant space that has not installed a submeter. Next slide.
Thanks, Emily. So what are next steps? So we are heavily into producing guidance. As Gina had mentioned, we're working on 321 guidance, filing guidance, and those are imminent. We also have our rules hearing on October 24th at 11. We're going to hear the 320 and 321 aspects of the rule, and then October 26th, we're going to hear the lighting and submetering part. Note that, after we consider testimony and decide on what's going to be a final rule, we'll publish the rule, and then it will go into effect 30 days after that. There is no council action when it comes to DOB rules. There was a question that popped up in the chat. So this is about us having the hearing. We invite everyone to testify, and we'll consider testimony. As many of you know, we're also working on a number of studies. The most imminent one relates to the industry manufacturing metric, which we're doing with NYSERDA. We still have to figure out, as the law directs us to, whether or not to have an energy efficiency metric with Local Law 97 compliance. And we have separate kind of working groups / studies going for hospitals, which we're doing in concert with other organizations and NYSERDA, and also taking a look at nonprofits and affordability and financing for 97 compliance. Finally, we have a number of future rules coming up. We've already mentioned the financial hardship, which is part of the 320 adjustments. That adjustment provision also concerns kind of legal limitations like landmarking that prevents an owner from complying with 97. We have a small but mighty cogen kind of working group at it that we will be doing a future rule on cogen and DR. And then as was actually mentioned in the mobilization plan, and as DOB is discussed in their 90-day commission, we are working on aligning the sustainability laws. We already talked about how we're doing it with local law 88 here. And we'll be looking at the auditing law, benchmarking law, energy grade law, etc. Next slide. So that's our presentation, but I want to do the accelerator pitch. Next slide. Again, this is a free service. Please call the accelerator. They will work with building owners. They will explain Local Law 97. They will pair building owners with technical experts and with financing opportunities. Next slide. And here is their contact information. So thank you. And I guess back over to you, Danielle, to ask the questions.
Thank you, everybody. And yeah, I invite Laura, Emily, Gina, and Beth to come back on the screen. Thank you so much for that great presentation. We have a lot of questions that were submitted live here for you. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a number that were submitted ahead of time. So just a reminder to those of you in the audience, you can upvote any question that has been submitted in the Q&A box. That will help us prioritize what we can get to in the time we have left. And I also want to remind everybody that the focus of today's webinar is about the content of the proposed rules that we just heard. We want to unpack those as much as possible, so we want to try and keep them focused. Anything we don't have time to get to, we are saving, and DOB said that they'll be able to get to them afterwards. Sorry, and Laura, I don't know if you want to, you seem like you're about to chime in with something. That was great. That was a lot to get through. To get us started, I actually want to ask a question, something that stuck out to me in the rules, which is on the beneficial electrification credit that you mentioned, Gina. So we know that burning fossil fuels on site is responsible for about 40% of the city's carbon emissions from building for heating and hot water. This credit, to me, seems like a unique and potentially transformative way to get a head start on cutting those emissions. Could you help translate why this credit is so important now, and how can it change the game for how building owners are thinking of complying with the law?
Great, thank you, Danielle. It is a great opportunity for us to really boost the electrification of existing buildings in the city. And we're all aware right now that for many owners, they have started to go down that road of looking at how they electrify their building. And it's really hard for them to get it to pencil out or to have a cost-effective and timely return. And many owners are faced with an increase of operational costs. Many of them feel like they don't have a pathway that can help them to electrify their building all at once. And this credit doesn't require that. This credit allows for incremental electrification over time. So owners can decide if they want to pick one system and electrify that system, or they want to start with just a portion of their building and electrify part of the equipment. Then this will give them the ability to get some credit for that. So in addition to reducing their fossil fuel use and seeing emissions for fossil fuels come down in their reporting, this treats their building like the grid is already clean. And then it is a negative coefficient so that they get some relief from the increased operational cost. And we have been seeing more buildings across the city that are starting to electrify. We've definitely heard from a lot of co-op and condo buildings that they are looking into it, and that some of these hurdles make it a really difficult decision for them. Instead, we want them to go ahead and have a pathway to do some of that work now to increase the help increase the market for electrification of equipment, to bring down the cost of products like heat pumps, to help increase the number of service providers that are out there, and to educate them on the types of systems that we will need to see in buildings all across the city in the future. So we're really excited about this, and we'll continue to monitor how much uptake there is for this credit. And we hope that it's widely subscribed early on.
Yeah, and I think it's really unique, and I hope people recognize that there is a sliding scale, that the earlier you act, the better the credit that you can receive for it. So I think it's really unique. A quick follow-up on that, based on what we're seeing in the chat, is the electrification credit available for new buildings? And does it apply to equipment that's installed prior to 2021?
It does not apply to new buildings. It only applies if they're replacing equipment that has fossil fuel-based emissions. We could maybe consider other types of equipment if they wanted to come to the department with a CCD1 or something like that, in case we've forgotten something. But our new buildings, just as a reminder for everyone, Local Law 154, which is our electrification law in New York City, is going to start affecting new projects come January 1st, 2024. So a few short months from now, buildings less than 7 stories are going to be required to start electrifying their space heating. And if they're not a multifamily building, then they will also be, they may also be eliminating space heating as service hot water heating as an option. But this is a requirement that is coming for most buildings, so it wouldn't make sense for it to be a credit.
Got it. Thank you. And then I just realized, while we're on this topic of the beneficial electrification credit, sorry, I just lost the question. How is the rule structured to ensure that the equipment installed is efficient? I think you covered it a bit, but there was a question in the chat of how does the rule define what qualifies as eligible equipment? So
there is a table for efficiency requirements within the rule. And if there is a piece of equipment that doesn't have an efficiency rating that is called out in the rule, then the owner that is contemplating using that equipment should come to the department and work out with us what those requirements should be.
Great, thank you. Okay, my next question, I think probably for Laura, and it's around the good faith definition that you've laid out here. From what you've described, the good faith criteria are designed to provide a pathway to get buildings on track in the first compliance period so that they can meet their 2030 carbon limits. This has gotten a lot of attention. We've got questions as part of the early Q&A. There's some in the chat now. Can you speak to any of the concerns that people might be having around how DOB is ensuring the necessary guardrails are in place to lead to concrete reductions in buildings and building carbon, and in the time frame that we need?
Sure. So, as we've discussed, we're required to look at good faith efforts. This is what we have to do. And so we wanted to make sure that we defined it as something that clearly shows building owners are taking real action towards achieving compliance. And so one of those ways is to long-term plan to decarbonize, which of course the current law doesn't require. So we want building owners to be looking all the way through 2050. They can certainly work with NYSERDA's FlexTech program to do that decarbonization planning. We'll be doing some more guidance on what the decarbonization plan must include. So an owner that's doing that is going to have the opportunity to comply, to have 2 more years to comply. The other good faith efforts are, what we call having shovels in the ground, basically either doing the work and having it not yet complete, or having all your, plans in, approvals done, permits, what have you, contractors, and ready to start. Again, to us, that is an owner who's clearly showing that they are making good faith efforts towards compliance. The electrification upgrade, we've heard from, several owners, and we know is very expensive and time consuming. And so to even begin to electrify equipment, they need to have that first step done. And so that is also clearly showing an intention to comply with Local Law 97. So if an owner doesn't follow through with what, you know, the mediated resolution says, then we will go back and find that owner from the beginning. So the owner gets an opportunity to show they're complying. We are supporting that owner. And then if the steps aren't actually followed through on, then the owner will have to pay all back fines. So we feel like we struck a balance of support, of carrot and stick on this one.
Yeah, and I think the point you made on submitting the permits as well in 2028, it really shows that that's really where they're showing the commitment, not only to this year, but to future years.
Right, on the decarbonization plan, exactly. So
yeah.
Again, moving forward, like with the upgrading the electricity, right? Next step will be that, moving forward.
Yeah, and a question we have here on the top relates to this, and just about the capacity. There's people asking about the capacity of DOB to consider these. So can you speak about, could any of you speak about the mediated resolution process and how that's intended to help that?
Sure. So we need to increase capacity at DOB to handle this. Again, the law, and I keep going back to it, the law requires us to consider these factors. So when the law was passed, it was meant for DOB to take a look at buildings, you know, on a case-by-case basis and consider their good faith efforts. So we have to do it. You know, part of this too is figuring out, we need to see where compliance is. We know that people have been moving into compliance, right? We have 9% positive movement into compliance. So we're not going to know until we get the first reports in May 1st, 2025, what that looks like, where building owners are. We're trying our best to mobilize them now, to give them, you know, clear benchmarks and clear pathways ahead. So we will, you know, this rule sets out good faith efforts very clearly. So, you know, that will be kind of hopefully easy to gauge, right? Because we've clearly stated this is what you need to do to meet a good faith effort. And so presumably we will be able to gauge that when the owners submit the reports. And then we will have the resolutions to match that. And so again, we will need staff to do it, but we are preparing to have that happen.
Great, thanks. I think it's really helpful for the audience to hear that process from your team. So thanks for taking the time to explain that. I'm going to pivot a bit towards some questions about reporting and accuracy in reporting. How does, and this might, I'm going to try and combine some questions here that we have coming in, but how do we help make sure that the data that buildings are submitting as a part of their benchmarking and for their local Law 97 compliance are aligned? How would any errors in what they're submitting from the utility be corrected? What are the ways to make sure that there's accuracy in the reporting, or how to go back and double check that if there's an error?
I mean, we will have to do a certain number of auditing of the reports, right? We haven't determined what that looks like yet. And so, you know, we are basing right now the, you know, calculators, et cetera, on compliance with the benchmarking data. You know, we think some owners are correcting for benchmarking data as we get close to the time period for the local Law 97 compliance to come in. We're getting questions from owners about square footage, you know, about their benchmarking data, et cetera. So, you know, we still have time to work with owners to answer those questions. I'm not sure, Gina, do you have anything to add?
Well, it is something that we've covered in the extension requirements that are covered under this set of rulemaking, that, you know, if an owner has a problem with their square footage, if they think that, for example, they don't even belong on the covered buildings list, then they can go work that out with DOF, and we're not going to penalize them for if as long as they're in that process. And another important thing to remember is that benchmarking can be submitted practically by anybody. But a local N97 report has to be submitted by an RDP. So I think that we're relying on the registered design professional to flag those things for owners. If their benchmarking looks like it's off, then they could also work on correcting that with their RDP and file for an extension and provide us with some background on why they can't get the report done. So errors happen, and we've seen a lot in benchmarking. I also do want to recognize that since 97 passed, I think we're seeing fewer errors in benchmarking because owners are caring more about the accuracy of that information now.
That's great. Thanks so much for clarifying that and for the difference in much more checks and balances in local law 97 reporting to ensure the accuracy. The next question I have relates to support for, I think maybe support and upfront for installing the equipment, but also maybe thinking about changing utility bills down the line with electric heat pumps. I see that someone's responded in the chat with, heat pumps can actually wind up using less energy in the first place, but can you speak at all to support for installations of equipment that might be needed to comply with the law for retrofits, and also anything you might be able to speak to on fuel costs in the future?
So, as we recognize, part of our mobilization plan is to target funding towards local law 97 compliance. And we are working, there is money available, obviously, at the state level, a lot of it. And we are working towards, with NYSERDA and PSC to get, and Con Ed, to get that to the customers that need them for compliance. There's federal money, there's accelerator. We're working on the tax programs, the J51 at the city level. So, while unfortunately there's not just like one-stop shop for here's, the one pot of money, it has to be drawn from different places. This is where a program like Accelerator, is very useful because they will be able to show owners where all these pots of money are, et cetera, that can be applicable to their building situation. So some work, and I believe the estimate is 25% of the work up through 2030 can be, paid for through gains in energy efficiency. Other work has to be financed, and this is where the city has stated that it needs to step up with its government partners to help fund and finance that with building owners. That'll be my part of the answer. Gina, do you have something to add about costs? Nope.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. So in terms of reporting, we have a question here, and there were some that we received ahead of time as well. Has the law outlined what a building emissions report should contain, or its structure, or how they'll submit that information?
We will have a filing guide.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will have a filing guide. It will be up soon. We are working on that.
Great.
And it's also important to know that we're working very closely with EPA to make our requirements for reporting align with what they can do in ESPM, so that we can continue to use that platform as a tool that supports both 84 and 97. And we'll get information out as quickly as we can, but there will be information that owners have to submit in DOB now because it can't be included in their ESPM reporting.
Got it. I want to make sure we get some questions that people had on the prescriptive path. So you mentioned in the presentation that there are 13 prescriptive energy conservation measures. 4 in particular will need detailed reports. There's a question here about what are those 4 measures that need more detailed accountability?
Sure, those are outlined in the rule, but I'll go ahead and cover them here. The first is the temperature controls and enclosures. So that's the TRVs and radiator covers that have a temperature control, and this applies to radiators, hydronic and steam buildings. And again, won't apply to every building. The second one is the 7th PECM, which is a requirement that there's an indoor-outdoor temperature sensor that can control how a boiler is operating, and that applies to a lot of different buildings, not just steam buildings. Number 8, which is functioning steam traps. Steam traps are the workhorses of steam systems, and if they are not operating correctly, your whole entire steam system can be affected. So we really do need owners to invest. That's an ongoing maintenance issue that owners should stay on top of. And we really need to see an investment in making sure that the steam traps within a steam system in a building are functioning as they should be. And then the last one is steam system venting. So likewise, if you have a steam system and the vents are not properly functioning, then it can throw the entire system out of whack, and you'll have all kinds of tenants opening their windows to try and cool off in the wintertime because they're overheated. So we need to see attention to the proper venting in steam systems. And those 4 are the ones that will have detailed reporting requirements for that one-time report.
Thank you, Gina. On this same, there's a question that some people have upvoted related to the buildings that have fewer than 35% rent regulated tenants in them. Those that have that 2-year delay. And I don't want to get too much on a tangent from the rest of the rules, but there are a specific set of buildings that maybe were on the prescriptive path, but have now 2 extra years to meet the targets. How does any of these rules apply to them, or do they have to comply in 2 years down the road?
So some of them will, the decarbonization plan won't apply because they will have the extra 2 years, but they would still have the opportunity to prove that they were, upgrading their electricity, they were a critical facility, et cetera. So it's really the decarb plan that's not going to apply to these buildings. It's a small, very small number of buildings comparatively.
Gotcha. But they want to be doing the same things that those buildings are to get ready for 20 for their compliance here. There were a couple before. I don't see them here, but I do want to make sure I get to them on the local law 88, which, just to remind everybody, has a separate date for hearing and commenting than the local law 97 rules. But there were a couple of questions that we received ahead of time, just clarifying what's covered. So will there be a covered buildings list for local law 88? And the rule right now says that the report will be in a form and manner determined by the department. When do you expect to have those reporting details available for people?
Sure. So the reporting for local law 88 will be along with the 97 reporting in DOB Now. So that will, when the DOB Now portal's open for 97, 88 will also be again, they just have to do an attestation for local law 88 compliance. Did I answer both of your questions?
I think, yeah. And there was a question on, is there a covered buildings list for local law 88?
Yes, there will be a covered buildings list for local law 88.
And for buildings that are not submitting a 97 report in 2025, because there are some buildings that don't, they will have the opportunity to use the DOB Now local law 88 portal without having to submit 97 reporting.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we've got some technical questions here. I'm trying to sift through and see if any of the recent ones have been asked. Okay, so we have one of the most upvoted questions right here relates to the deemed use calculation for the heating capacity of greater than 12. Is this in total for all of the equipment that's using the beneficial electrification credit, or an individual piece of the equipment? So if they're switching from a steam boiler plant to packaged turbo heat pumps, do they need to total the capacities of those together? I don't know if you can help. I'm probably doing a poor job of summarizing that, but it seems people are interested in that one. So I'm wondering if you could speak to it.
We'll cover that in the filing guide.
Got it. Okay. So where the footnote, there's a footnote that indicates there's penalty adjustments available for landmarks. Does this include buildings within a landmark historic district? And how would an adjustment for landmark buildings happen, or what can we expect in the future on landmark buildings?
So actually, I'm going to let Beth answer that.
Yeah, we're in our next rule package, we'll be talking about the adjustments in the law that apply to buildings that have hurdles that they can't overcome from external circumstances, which may include the zoning resolution or rules from the Landmark Preservation Commission. So we are working with LPC now to understand their approval process and how we can ensure that buildings get to swiftly do the work that is needed for compliance. And it's going very well, and we don't have concerns about buildings facing hurdles due to their landmark status. We'll be assessing those on a case-by-case basis, but we're working with LPC to figure out a process for that.
Great, thank you. I see a clarification question here, which I believe is relating to local law 88, but it's saying our apartment building amenity spaces, the common areas, so do laundry rooms, gyms, community rooms also need to be submetered as a part of the local law 88?
That would be if they're a separate tenant. So only if they're a separate tenant.
And there's
Got
a
it.
pretty big size threshold. So it would have to be a large space for them to have to submeter.
Great. So there are a couple of questions ahead of time, and a few here on the interest of the role of RECs as a part of compliance. Can you reiterate if and how does rulemaking limit RECs, and what you expect that impact might be, and any other details for those who might not be familiar with how RECs relate to the law?
Sure. So right now, based on law and rule, RECs are already limited to only be able to offset electricity emissions. So they cannot be used to offset fossil fuel emissions. Beyond that, we've limited RECs if someone chooses the decarb plan compliance option. If they choose that pathway, they are not allowed to comply in the first compliance period buying RECs. Otherwise, buildings can buy RECs, again, based on the limit already that it cannot be used beyond electricity. And so we are consistently studying the RECs market, which is a moving target. The earliest that RECs are expected are late in 2026. So RECs are not available. If someone wants to buy RECs and has a potential penalty and is not doing work, they're going to be paying the penalty for the first several years, right? Because RECs aren't coming on. We anticipate that RECs are going to be more expensive than originally thought. And our assessment is that currently, based on the RECs, the perceived RECs prices that were in the PSC petition, they're only economically viable in this first compliance period. They do not look to be economic when compared to paying the penalty. I should add that they do not look to be economically viable in the second or subsequent compliance periods when compared to paying the penalty. So again, it's a moving target. And so we are constantly looking at the REC market and working with people experts in the field to continually understand it. But for now, again, the limits are electricity and in the decarb plan.
Thanks, Laura. And on that electricity, the changing electricity grid, there's a question that relates to back to the beneficial electrification calculation. But is it the 2030 electricity coefficient that is used for the beneficial electrification credit, or the 2024?
The beneficial electrification credit has its own coefficient. And so for the energy consumed by that equipment, it should be using the coefficient that's in the rule. And that is based on when they install that equipment. The rest of the electricity that's consumed by the building from the utility grid would use the coefficient that's established in the rules. So 2024 was set by law, and the coefficient for 2030 was set in the rule last year.
Okay, and I think hopefully maybe I'm clarifying the question a little bit. It may be in reference to the one-time emission reduction or two-time emission reduction, depending on the sliding scale of when you install it. Is that 2 times one-time emission reduction based on the 2024 coefficient, or 2-time based on the 2024 coefficient, or based on the 2030? And I hope that's not too wonky of a question.
It's not based on the 2024 or 2030 coefficient at all.
It's not at all. Okay.
It's a coefficient that was established, and it's negative because we have estimated some of the cost increase to operate that equipment. So it's an entirely separate coefficient.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to try and we have just, I think, like 2 or 3 minutes left. So sorry if we're hopping around between topics a little bit, but I want to try to get to the things that people are most interested in. Can the beneficial electrification credit be applied to replacing electric resistance or district steam equipment with heat pumps? Or does it apply only to on-site combustion equipment?
In the rule, we've said it has to be replacing fossil fuel equipment. If somebody feels that they're replacing equipment where there is a very large emissions benefit that isn't captured, then we could consider that through a CCD1.
Got it. Thank you.
Can I add something, Danielle? I see that people are asking if this applies to co-ops and condos. So it does. It applies to any building 25,000 square feet or more in the city. And so, yeah, just to make sure that's out there.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out. And hopefully some of these rules can help those co-ops and guide them towards compliance in a way that makes sense for them. I think in the future, as the city develops and implements some of these financing options and other means of support that have been outlined in the mobilization package, will there be future webinars on how buildings can take advantage of those different financing options, or how can people get more information about that?
Buildings should contact the accelerator, and the accelerator will work with them on financing options. That is our vehicle that the city is funded to help building owners figure that out. And the accelerator, I mean, it has, these one-on-ones, like there is a case manager assigned to building owners, et cetera. That said, the accelerator also does general information sessions, and sometimes we join those, like I had mentioned earlier, in different council districts and whatnot. But really what you want is the one-on-one service if you're a building owner. So I would just highly recommend to contact the accelerator.
Great. Well, I think we are nearing the end of our time here. I want to thank the 4 of you again so much for coming and talking with our audience at Urban Green. This has been really helpful for us to unpack these rules. Clearly, people have lots of questions, and as I said at the start of this, for the questions that we didn't get to, both in the submitted live question and answer today and in those we received before. We have saved those, and we're going to get answers for as many of those as possible. And if you have questions on specific circumstances, you can reach out to DOB and the accelerator with some of those questions that were more specific. Before we close it out, I want to pass it back over to our CEO, John Van Dyke, to give our last word.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Laura, Gina, Emily, Beth, for such a great discussion and sharing of information. I would invite everybody to check out Urban Green's Local Law 97 resource page to learn more about the law. We have a summary about the new regulations there as well. And while you're there, check us out. If you're not a member, please join us so you can stay on top of the latest and the analysis that we provide and the research that we provide and all the programming on decarbonization. I also want to take this opportunity to invite you to our gala, which is on October 5th at Chelsea Piers. The gala is a great event. It's the premier green building networking event in town. We have a great time with it. Not a big program, so you're not stuck at a table for a long time. And it is our #1 way of raising funds to do the work that we do at Urban Green. So please check us out. So thank you again for joining us today. I hope everybody enjoys the remainder of Climate Week. And please join us at the next Urban Green program. Thank you. Have a good day.